Hello, future scientists. Today we're going to talk about the anatomy of the central nervous system. So we're going to talk about the structures of the brain. Previously we talked about the synapses and how our brain sends our messages to our muscles. But today we're going to talk about the different components of the brain and what each of those components does. Okay, so let's get started. So the brain, a couple of fun facts about our brain. The adult human brain weighs about 2¼ to 3¼ pounds and contains approximately 100 billion neurons. We often joke about somebody having a big brain or a small brain, but in actuality, about 6.7% of our intelligence is based off of the size of our brain. And we have four major regions of the brain. These are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So let's start with the cerebrum. So this is the largest portion of the brain. These are going to be the large lobes of the brain here. The outer surface of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, this is our gray matter, and when we were doing our sheep dissection, we could see the difference between the gray matter and the white matter. The internal tissue is myelinated white matter, so we should know what myelinated means. It's going to be pretty much insulated white matter. So the surface of brain is not smooth, as we've seen. Each curve is called a gyrus, and each groove is called a sulcus. So we have the gyruses here, and then the grooves are going to be the sulcus here. There are four lobes of the brain divided by the sulci, and that's just plural for sulcus. So let's start with the frontal lobes. And we saw these kind of creepy pictures in our anatomy text, so this kind of just illustrates what functions by what part of each parts of the brain. And you can notice that there's a really pretty large section for smaller parts that we need to move comparatively to these larger parts of our body. And that's because we have fine motor functions here. So we don't need as many neurons to kind of move our fingers or move our big, larger muscle groups as we do to, say, see or smell or taste. So the frontal lobe in general is going to be located behind the forehead in the anterior portion of the brain. So this is going to be our frontal lobe. And it contains the primary motor cortex, which sends neural impulses to the skeletal muscles to initiate and control development of muscle tension and movement of our body parts. So it's going to basically be the basis of certain parts of our body's movement. Smaller regions of the primary motor cortex control major body segments, and larger regions control smaller body segments. So that's what we were just talking about. We need some fine motor function, so we need more neurons to work fine motor functions than we do larger motor functions. So the left frontal lobe is going to include the Broca's area, which controls the tongue and lip movements required for speech. So parts of the frontal lobe control our speech. And we have the parietal lobe. So when we're talking about these lobes, we have one on each side, basically. So we have a parietal lobe here on the left side, and we have a parietal lobe on the right side as well. And these are immediately posterior or behind the frontal lobes here. This is going to include the primary somatic sensory cortex, and these interpret our senses. And we'll do some labs this week about our senses, but these are going to be any impulses received from skin, internal organs, muscles, and joints. So you can see again, we have a large area for our face and a pretty large area for our tongue, even though it's a small part. And this is because we have some fine motor functions that need to happen here. The occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is going to be in the back of your cerebrum, and this is responsible for vision. And then your temporal lobe. This is going to be the most inferior lobes from the frontal and parietal lobes above them. So we have the temporal on our temple here. And this is involved in speech, hearing, vision, memory, and emotion. So a pretty important part in this smaller portion of our cerebrum. So then we have our diencephalon. This is also known as the interbrain, and we saw this when we were dissecting our sheep brain, located deep inside the brain, enclosed by the cerebral hemisphere. So these are going to include the following structures. It's going to include the thalamus, which communicates sensory and motor information between the body and the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, this regulates a lot of our body functions and maintains homeostasis. So it's going to regulate metabolism, heart rate, blood pressure, thirst, hunger, energy level, and body temperature. So anything that's going to basically help us maintain homeostasis is going to happen in the hypothalamus. The epithalamus, these includes the pineal glands and regulates the sleep cycle hormones that it secretes. So the pineal glands, which we located on the sheep brain, are going to basically control some hormone balances in our brain. And we have our brainstem. So this is shaped like a stem and includes three structures. It includes the midbrain. This is a relay station for sensory and motor impulses. So it's going to relay information about vision, hearing, motor activity, sleep, and wake cycles. And then we have the pons located below the midbrain. This regulates breathing, pretty important. The medulla oblongata regulates heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and controls reflexes for coughing, sneezing, and vomiting. So these are pretty important structures in our brain stem we could not live without. So the cerebellum, this is below the occipital lobe. You couldn't really see it if you're just looking at a brain. It's going to be hidden underneath this cerebrum. So found below the occipital lobe, looks similar to the cerebrum. This serves the role of coordinating body movements and balance. And if we think back when we were doing the dissection, this is going to be like the branching tree-like brain that we saw in the sheep brain. This receives input from the eyes, inner ears, and sensory receptors throughout the body. Meninges. The meninges are going to protect the brain. So they're protective membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord. In fact, you got extra credit for removing a meninge from the covering of your brain or the sheep brain. So they're really important structures throughout that protect the brain. And then we have a blood-brain barrier. Your brain has a lot of blood cycling through it. In fact, at any one time, about 25% of our blood in our body is going to be located in our brain. So this is important for providing the brain with nutrients, with oxygen, and excreting waste, getting waste out of the brain as well. The spinal cord. So the spinal cord extends from the brainstem down to the beginning of the lumbar region of the spine. Remember, when we were doing bones, lumbar region is down at the bottom. Major pathways for relaying sensory impulses to the brain and motor impulses. So it's basically kind of a pit stop to relay impulses out to the muscles as well as into the muscles and to the brain, in from the muscles into the brain. So this provides neural connections. Okay, so that's all I have for you for the anatomy of our brain and brain components. So go ahead and feel free to pause, go back, make sure you're filling out your note outline with this video.